Hello, this is Mr. Ferreira, and I'm going to talk you through the introduction to the specification that is examinable for the exam. Okay, so first things first, let's have a look at a few things here. We see that it says specification 4.3.10. Okay, this is not meant to be anything cryptic other than to indicate that it's the options section of the specification, and it's one of 10 parts of the course. There were 9 options, and then there's issues and debates. Okay, so for you perhaps need to know that this is the section that they're asking, that they can actually ask questions on, they can examine you on. And the first part I'm going to do today is describing addiction. Now I'm going to try and split this video up into 2 because I don't want to make them too long, but you'll see that we have 3 components to this: physical and psychological dependence, being dependence is the key issue here, tolerance, and then withdrawal. Now we will also see that it's very difficult to separate the 3. However, the specification has asked us to look at these 3 things. To put this in context, we've spent some time looking at an introduction to addiction. This is not examinable, but should help you in the exam, in that we need to make sure that we have a look at addiction in a much kind of more defined way. That it's not just about the physical, psychological dependence, tolerance and withdrawal, that it is something bigger, because the key to addiction is that we often have substances like alcohol, even recreational drugs that people take and they are not addicts, or there are behaviors like gambling that become addictive to some people but it's not an addiction to others. So therefore the whole first part of this introduction was to let you see things like that trauma and isolation and kind of what is going on in the person's life may actually be the reason or the background to a person's addiction, and not this idea that it's just simply physical, that if you take a drug you become addicted. Now, of course, in terms of the specification, I know this, but you may not know, that this is quite a new part of the addiction course. They are trying to get us to use the correct language of addiction. So let's look at some of that language. And before we get there, I have a couple of pictures to show you. And what we find in these pictures is that I'm not trying to shock you into anything. This is not a PSHE lesson where I'm saying don't do drugs. This is about you getting to see that when we have a picture like this of the same person a year apart, and we see in the second picture she looks quite different and not necessarily as kind of healthy and as well as she was in the first picture. Okay, I have another set of pictures. Now this is a different person. Yes, there's a much bigger age gap between the first picture and the second picture, but certainly at age 33 this person does not look like her body has physically aged well or managed kind of life very well. And I ask a very simple question: what has happened? Now this is not meant to be a trick question, and obviously we're doing a course on addiction, so what is clear here is, of course, the difference between age 22 and age 33 is that this person has gone on to become an addict, and through her addiction her body has taken a physical toll, and she now looks like this. Okay, now of course I'm pretty certain that at age 22 she didn't want to look like this. At age 33 there must be something quite severe, quite kind of disturbing that will get her to this particular point. I have a couple of other pictures. So of a man now, I'm pretty certain that he didn't envisage that you would have this kind of faraway expression in his eyes, his hair will be long and matted, and his face will be scarred. Certainly this next set of pictures shows quite a dramatic contrast between the two, and I can't imagine that there's too many years difference between the two. Quite ironically, it is the same person, you can see by the tattoo. Okay, so let's kind of explore these types of ideas. The first one, of course, is going to be physical and psychological dependence. Now, I would hope at this stage that you can kind of know the difference between the words physical and psychological, and you may have even heard the word dependence. Now, of course, the word dependence, we perhaps use in language things like dependent. Okay, so what we see here is that somebody is dependent if they need, and that's quite an important word, they need to feel normal. Okay, so what I'm saying, a sign of dependence, is about this idea that there's something, could be in this particular case a physical substance, heroin, nicotine, in order to feel normal. Now, of course, you've probably grown up with this idea of knowing the difference between need and want. And this is actually deliberately using the word need. In order to feel normal, I need the substance. In order to feel normal, I need the behavior. Okay, so that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of dependence. Now, I have to say, it's not only addicts who have dependencies. Okay, in fact, if you go back to the word dependent, many of you are probably, or all of you, are in some ways dependent on the people you're living with. Okay, so therefore, we mustn't just simply say that the only sign of an addict is this idea of physical dependence. But of course, what we can say is that every addict will have a physical dependence on whatever it is that they are addicted to. Okay, so dependence often accompanies addiction. Now, if you don't believe me that we can be dependent without being addicted, I would say that if you look at something like water, especially if you drink a lot of water, you're quite dependent on having that water in your system. I know that when I try to increase my water intake, the days that I kind of forgot to take a water bottle, I'd quite easily get a headache because my body had got used to. And that's another way we can have a look at it. My body is used to or dependent on kind of getting the drug in or water into my body, and therefore it kind of tells me that things aren't quite right. Now, I tried to say that without using the word tolerance, and this is the thing that you're going to find really, really difficult. This is a very small subsection that says physical dependence, and we're also going to look at psychological dependence, but I can't really separate it from the words tolerance and withdrawal. Because the reason I'm dependent is because over time my body has become tolerant to the particular substance. Okay, so the next thing we need to have a look at, the way that they kind of classify the specification, is that they want us to make a distinction between physical dependence and psychological dependence. And I suppose the only real difference is that the unpleasant symptoms, okay, that is associated with dependence, okay, is physical for physical dependence and psychological for psychological dependence. So what we could say is that ultimately, if you are in a situation where you're dependent on a particular substance, your body then tells you through physical pain or discomfort, and we will often just call this withdrawal, that you need this particular drug to feel normal. Okay, so what we often then say is that if you're dependent, you often depend on the drug. Okay, just to kind of put it plainly, if I drink alcohol regularly, in fact, maybe you have a grandparent who perhaps drinks a sundowner. Okay, if you don't know what that is, you need to ask them. Okay, so often, get kind of 5, 6 o'clock, you sit outside or you sit in your living room and you have a little drink to kind of, relax after a long day. Now, of course, if I do that every single day, I might build up some level of dependence on that. What this means in the real world is that I might start showing physical symptoms the day I don't drink that little sundowner. Okay, so we can see how this works, that we have physical dependence because we need to feel normal, and that could be down to this idea that our body has some kind of withdrawal reaction that makes us want to kind of avoid those negative feelings. So I then go on to kind of draw that link between, I mentioned withdrawal previously, but now the link between tolerance. Okay, now this is also something which I'll go into with much bigger detail in the next video, but I think we also are familiar with this idea of tolerance. Okay, so let's give you kind of a classic example. So maybe the first time you ever drank alcohol, okay, and you were lucky enough to snag yourself a Bacardi Breezer. A couple of sips in, you were already feeling tipsy, okay? So one Bacardi Breezer and you feeling a little bit tipsy, okay? Now, of course, you are hardened party goers now, and the more you drink alcohol, the more Bacardi Breezers you have. It doesn't have to be every day, but it could be over a period of time. Your body gets used to it, okay, and we call that tolerance. And now it takes maybe as many as 2 or 3 Bacardi Breezers before you feel tipsy. Now, of course, that's a hypothetical situation because none of you are 18 and none of you have had an alcoholic beverage before. Okay, so I do still try and be funny even if I'm alone in a room by myself. Okay, so the next part, obviously the specification does talk about psychological dependence. Now, this is not going to be dramatically different from physical dependence, but of course the withdrawal symptoms are going to trigger thoughts, emotions, and things like that, other obsessions or psychological pain rather than physical pain. Okay, so you can say you're psychologically dependent if the withdrawal or the negative kind of consequences of being dependent are kind of more psychological. Okay, so it's often then shown in this idea of a strong urge to use the particular substance. Okay, and so we also have an introduction to this idea of cravings. Okay, so obviously we can have physical cravings, but we're also saying that we have psychological cravings. In fact, some people would argue that smoking is actually more a psychological experience than a physiological experience because of kind of how you kind of feel when you don't get to smoke. Okay, so we see it says here both types of dependence experience this intense desire to repeat the particular behavior. Now, when we talk about these things, it really is important that we get to see that withdrawal, tolerance, and dependence are all kind of intertwined. But of course, we need to make that clear distinction between physical dependence and psychological dependence and be able to explain kind of what they are in relation to addiction. The only thing we need to add to this, of course, is this idea of abstaining. Okay, so if I don't take the particular drug, or if I don't do the particular behavior, what happens is these cravings become intensified and I start to feel bad. Okay, so that feel, because remember we're linking back to my original statement about being normal. Okay, I stop feeling normal. Okay, so of course it becomes incredibly difficult for me to stop the addictive behavior because I know that potentially if I just have another drink, or if I kind of go back to the behaviour, I may well actually start feeling kind of the way that I want to feel. Now, the only last thing I kind of want to add to this idea is that this kind of idea of coping, we saw in the addictive, or the introduction to addiction, this idea that addiction may kind of be something that's out of control. Okay, so of course, if I'm able to cope, then I'm not out of control. But if I'm unable to cope, okay, now we've got to be a little bit sympathetic here. So if everything that my psychology, everything that my physiology is telling me is that all I need is just a little bit more, I may feel that I'm unable to cope. Okay, and as such, kind of, as I said, things like trauma, I might be using the addictive behavior to cope with the trauma. I also might be isolated, so I might find it difficult to if I'm isolated, to abstain, and therefore it becomes incredibly difficult to stop addictive behavior because of this desire to use again. Now, I probably have gone into too much detail about psychological dependence. What you need to be able to do quite clearly is to be able to define and say what physiological dependence is, and I would certainly focus on this idea of this feeling normal. Okay, in order to, you're dependent, you need the particular addictive substance or behavior to feel normal. And then you need to also be able to relate that to psychological dependence. But I want to end with this kind of perhaps a deeper question. Well, why does psychological dependence arise? Why do we have this? Why don't we just have a mechanism that turns it off? And I don't want to go into too much detail, but I know that some of you may find this interesting. So this is not something that is in the exam. However, it could give you some insight into people, into addictive behavior. Now, Epstein pretty much, and I've really heavily summarized this, says that we pretty much have two ways to deal with things. Okay, so we have two information processing systems. One is rational and one is experiential. Okay, now what we find in the rational system, this is emotion free. Okay, so we take maybe a behavior that could turn out to be a problem. Okay, so I might be thinking, okay, it's a Friday evening, I've had a long week, maybe I should, crack open a can of lager. Okay, and of course, I'm fairly rational. I can look back at my week and look at my day. I can even look at things like, okay, so maybe I've had a couple of beers this week, maybe I shouldn't drink tonight, and things like that. I'm completely, able to rationalize it. Okay, so it says using this system, we're able to work out the right and appropriate way to behave. Okay, and maybe I get 2 or 3 lagers in, and I'm thinking, what, I'm tired. I've got to get up in the morning and look after my children. I'm going to stop there. Okay. However, we have these two systems. The next system, the experiential system. Now, this is actually driven by our feelings. Okay. And so what it says here, the relative contribution of each varies from none at all to complete dominance by one of the systems. Okay. So of course, the problem is how I feel. Now, linking back to trauma, linking back to isolation, okay, I am absolutely going to fail at acting rationally when potentially my psychological dependence kicks in. So maybe I am feeling as if I'm a failure and I can't do anything positive, and so therefore turning to another drink to make me feel better might kick in, and now suddenly my rational side is kind of turning off. Or I could have experienced something kind of bad, something really terrible could have happened to me, or I could be, I could kind of be at an end of a relationship, or maybe I'm struggling to cope with the lockdown, whatever it could be. So you can see how suddenly your feelings could overtake and you start acting irrationally. So it kind of does say, and go back to the question here, the question was, why does it arise? Well, the reason it arises is because sometimes the things that are going on in our lives, the experiential system, basically override our rational system, and therefore we can't control, we can't cope, and therefore we keep on drinking, keep on doing the addictive behaviour, whatever it could be. Okay, so that is all I'm going to do for now. I really do need to apologise if any of my examples are too close to home, because obviously, as I said, addictive behaviour is something which many of you might have actually had an experience with in terms of people you know, and it can be really difficult to hear these things. But what I'm hoping is that you get to see or understand kind of what is going on with an addict. What I will do in the next video is to look at tolerance, and I'll look at withdrawal, and we'll kind of put them all together and end with a question. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, bye.